In the spring of 1986, in a city built to showcase the promise of atomic energy, the invisible became deadly in a single night. This is a story drawn from the pages of history, about reactor operators who saw impossible numbers, firefighters who battled flames they didn't understand, and 50,000 people whose ordinary lives ended in 36 hours. From the control room of Reactor 4 to the empty streets of Pripyat, this is the story of Chernobyl's first night when the sky burned blue and the future died with it. Subscribe to support more stories from history's darkest corners. He adjusted his glasses and noted the time in the logbook with careful script. His wife would be awake when he returned at dawn, brewing tea in their apartment on Lesya Ukrainka Street, where their daughter's school drawings covered the refrigerator. The reactor's cooling system needed to be reduced gradually. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual about the night except the slight delay in receiving approval from Moscow, but delays were common enough. The Soviet system moved at its own pace. Across the city, Dmitri Sokolov played cards with his brigade in the fire station's second-floor common room. 28 years old, married for 4 years, father to a son who'd just learned to write his own name. The radio played softly, a jazz program from Kiev that cut in and out. Someone made a joke about the reactor workers, how they thought they were so important with their white coats and security badges. Dmitri laughed, slapping down a winning hand. His shift partner, Anatoly, groaned and threw his cards down. Through the open window, the cooling towers of the power plant glowed faintly against the dark horizon, constant as the stars. Viktor Volkov sat in his office in the administrative building, reviewing evacuation protocols he'd never needed. 47 years old, party member since university, responsible for civil defense coordination. The protocols were theoretical. Exercises conducted annually with the precision of theater. Pripyat was a model city, built for the atom, populated by the best and brightest. The youngest city in the Soviet Union, average age 26, with more children per capita than anywhere else in the Ukrainian SSR. On his desk, a photograph showed him shaking hands with a minister in Moscow. The citation beneath it praised his dedication to socialist progress. Dr. Sergei Ivanov finished his evening rounds at Pripyat Hospital, checking on a child with pneumonia, an old man recovering from a stroke, a woman scheduled for minor surgery in the morning. 52 years old, trained in Moscow, he'd requested assignment to Pripyat 5 years ago because the facilities were new, the equipment modern. His wife preferred city life, but this place had grown on him, the sense of purpose, the young families, the belief that they were building something important. He locked his office and walked home through streets planted with young trees that would be magnificent in another decade. In Reactor 4's control room, the numbers began to shift. Aleksandr noticed first a slight fluctuation in the cooling rate, nothing alarming but worth monitoring. He made a note, consulted the procedure manual. The test required reducing power to a specific level, maintaining it, then seeing how long the turbines could generate electricity through inertia alone if external power failed. A question of safety margins. He signaled to his colleague, who adjusted the control rods according to protocol. The city's heartbeat was the power plant. 4 reactors, a 5th under construction, providing electricity to Kiev and beyond. The workers lived in apartment blocks arranged in neat rectangles, shopped at stores stocked better than most Soviet cities, sent their children to schools with new textbooks. May Day celebrations were planned for the following week, parades, speeches, the sense of collective achievement that defined life here. Everything functioned, everything was maintained, everything was safe because the regulations said it was safe. At 1:23 a.m., Aleksandr saw something impossible. The power level, which should have been declining smoothly, suddenly surged. Numbers climbed across the console displays with mechanical indifference. He reached for the emergency shutdown, the AZ5 button designed for exactly this situation. His hand was steady, his training was good. He pressed it. The control rods began to descend into the reactor core, designed to slow the reaction, to restore normal function. Instead, the reaction accelerated. It happened in seconds. The kind of seconds that stretch and compress simultaneously, where understanding arrives too late to matter. The control rods, inserted from above, had graphite tips. For an instant, a brief, terrible instant, the graphite displaced cooling water and briefly increased the reaction rate before the neutron-absorbing material could take effect. It was a design flaw known to the engineers who'd built the RBMK reactors, documented in classified reports, never corrected, because correction would have meant admitting imperfection. The reactor's power output multiplied 100-fold in 4 seconds. Aleksandr felt the floor shudder. The lights flickered. Then came the sound. Not an explosion in the cinematic sense, but a deep structural rupture, the sound of physics overwhelming engineering. The 1,000-ton reactor lid, a massive disk of steel and concrete, lifted like a pot lid pushed by boiling water, tilted and fell back partially, leaving the reactor core exposed to the night air. He looked at the readings that no longer made sense, at his colleague's face going pale, at the telephone he should pick up but somehow couldn't. Through the reinforced window, he saw something that would haunt his remaining days. A blue glow rising into the darkness, beautiful as aurora, deadly as cancer. Ionized air, radiation visible to the naked eye. The reactor's fuel assemblies were exposed, burning at temperatures that turned metal to vapor. The fire station's alarm screamed at 1:28 a.m. Dmitri was moving before fully awake, boots on, coat grabbed from the hook, sliding down the pole to the truck bay where engines were already roaring. The dispatcher's voice came through crackling with static. "Fire at the power station, Reactor 4. No other details, no mention of radiation, no protective equipment issued because no one had told them this wasn't an ordinary fire. They arrived 6 minutes later, Dmitri and 27 other men, and saw flames rising from the reactor building's roof. Graphite burned with intense heat. The reactor's moderator, designed to sustain the nuclear reaction, now feeding a conventional fire. They unrolled hoses. They aimed water at flames that seemed to twist away from the spray. Dmitri climbed a ladder to the roof, felt heat through his boots, saw pieces of fuel scattered across the surface, glowing dull red. He didn't know each piece was emitting more radiation than 100 X-rays per second. He worked for 3 hours until the initial flames were controlled, until his hands began to feel numb in a way that had nothing to do with cold. When he finally descended, he noticed his skin looked flushed, reddened as if sunburned. Anatoly mentioned feeling nauseated. Another firefighter vomited beside the truck. They were told to go home, clean up, report back for debriefing in the afternoon. Pripyat woke to a Saturday that seemed ordinary. Children went to playgrounds, people shopped for groceries. The sun rose over a city where invisible particles drifted on spring breezes, settling on laundry hung to dry, on freshly washed cars, on the hair of young mothers pushing strollers. Radiation has no smell, no taste, no immediate sensation. The body absorbs it unknowingly, cells damaged without pain, DNA unraveling in silence. Victor received the first reports at dawn. An accident contained no danger to the population. These were the words approved for use. He read protocols that suggested evacuation should begin within hours of any significant release, but the measurements he was shown indicated levels described as elevated but manageable. He trusted the experts. The experts were party members, trained in Soviet institutes, dedicated to truth as defined by collective understanding. To evacuate would be to admit crisis. To admit crisis would be to admit failure. Failure was not an option in a model city. Dr. Ivanov's morning shift brought the first casualties, firefighters, reactor workers complaining of nausea, headaches, unusual fatigue. He examined them with growing unease. The symptoms were consistent, appearing too quickly, too severely. He'd read about radiation sickness in medical school, theoretical knowledge from Hiroshima studies, from industrial accidents in the West. He requested blood counts. The results came back showing white cell levels already dropping, platelets declining. His hands were steady as he filled out the charts, but his mind was racing toward a conclusion he wasn't permitted to voice. When he tried to note suspected radiation exposure in a patient file, his supervisor removed the sheet, replaced it with one that read, "Viral infection, cause undetermined." The supervisor's face was apologetic but firm. "We must not cause panic, Sergei Dmitrovich. Moscow will send specialists. They will make the proper determination." The specialists arrived by afternoon, men in suits with Geiger counters that clicked steadily as they moved through the hospital corridors. They spoke in low voices, made calls to Moscow, and issued instructions. Admit the patients, keep them isolated, tell their families nothing specific. Dr. Ivanov watched Dmitri's wife arrive, young and frightened, asking questions he was forbidden to answer truthfully. He told her it was exhaustion, exposure to smoke, nothing serious. She believed him because she needed to believe him. By evening, the radiation over Pripyat measured hundreds of times normal background levels. Children still played outside. Mayday preparations continued. Victor sat in meetings where officials debated in careful language, weighing the political cost of evacuation against the human cost of delay. Someone mentioned that buses would need to come from Kiev, that organizing transport for 50,000 people would take time. Someone else noted that evacuation might suggest the reactor couldn't be controlled, might damage the reputation of Soviet nuclear engineering. The discussion continued for hours. Aleksandr was already in Moscow, flown out with other reactor personnel for specialized treatment. He knew what he'd absorbed in those first seconds, had seen the dosimeter readings before they'd rushed him away. Enough radiation to kill within weeks, possibly sooner. He'd asked about his family. No one would answer. He lay in a hospital bed, skin already showing the first signs of damage, and thought about his daughter's drawings on the refrigerator, wondered if someone had thought to water the plants in their apartment. Saturday afternoon in Pripyat felt like Sunday morning might never come. An ordinary weekend suspended in the peculiar stillness that follows catastrophe before anyone admits catastrophe has occurred. The reactor continued burning through daylight hours, sending its invisible payload across neighborhoods where couples argued about dinner plans and teenagers gathered at the cultural center to plan evening activities. The radiation meters brought from Kiev clicked their steady warnings to audiences of officials who debated what the clicking meant, what it allowed them to say, what it forced them to do. Victor stood at his office window watching children ride bicycles in geometric patterns around the square. His instructions from the regional party headquarters were precise. Maintain calm, await further direction, prepare contingency plans without implementing them. The contingency plans sat in folders that had never been opened in an actual emergency. He'd conducted drills, need exercises where everyone knew their roles, where buses arrived on schedule, where 50,000 people evacuated in an orderly fashion within 3 hours. Reality was different. Reality involved telephone calls to Moscow that went unanswered, instructions that contradicted previous instructions, and the terrible weight of a decision he wasn't authorized to make. He'd sent his own family away that morning. His wife and 2 sons, on a train to her mother's village 300 kilometers south. He'd told her it was precautionary, probably unnecessary, but better safe than sorry. She'd looked at him with the expression wives develop after 20 years of marriage, the look that says they know you're lying but love you enough to pretend otherwise. His sons had been excited about an unexpected trip, packing toys for grandmother's house. The train had departed at noon. He'd watched from the platform and then returned to his office to tell other families that everything was fine. Dr. Ivanov's hospital was filling beyond capacity. By mid-afternoon, 40 patients occupied beds in hallways, waiting rooms, any space that could accommodate a stretcher. The firefighters were worst, Dmitri and his brigade showing advanced symptoms that couldn't be explained by smoke inhalation. Dmitri's skin had darkened to an angry red, his face swollen, his speech slurred with nausea. He kept asking about his wife, his son, whether they should leave the city. Dr. Ivanov changed bandages on burns that weren't thermal burns, administered medication that wouldn't help, and lied with the practiced ease that Soviet medicine sometimes required. "You'll recover," he told Dmitri, whose eyes suggested he knew better. "A few days of rest, proper treatment. The specialists from Moscow are very good." The specialists from Moscow were overwhelmed. They'd arrived expecting a containable incident. and found instead a crisis without precedent. The radiation readings near the reactor exceeded their equipment's measurement capacity. The counters simply maxed out and stayed there, needles pinned to the highest marks. They'd sent for better equipment, for lead shielding, for protective gear that didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Meanwhile, the reactor burned, and the smoke carried cesium, strontium, plutonium across a landscape where farmers tended fields and fishermen cast lines into the Pripyat River. Saturday evening brought a strange festivity to the city's center. The cafe remained open, serving ice cream to families who'd heard vague rumors but received official assurances. A wedding party celebrated at the Palace of Culture. The bride's white dress photographed against spring flowers while radiation particles settled invisibly on the fabric. Musicians played, couples danced, and life continued because no one in authority had told it to stop. The human capacity for normalcy in abnormal circumstances is remarkable. People will believe what makes their world manageable for as long as belief seems possible. Alexander's colleague from the control room, Leonid Toptunov, was dying in the same Moscow hospital, in a room 3 doors down. 26 years old, married 8 months, he'd been operating the reactor controls during the test. He'd followed procedures exactly as written, pressed buttons he'd been trained to press, and now his body was destroying itself from the inside out. The radiation had damaged his bone marrow, his digestive system, his skin. The doctors tried treatments that worked in theory, but failed in practice because the radiation doses were too high, the damage too extensive. Alexander could hear him screaming sometimes when the pain medication wore off. The nurses moved quickly with morphine, their faces masked with professional compassion that couldn't quite hide their horror. He wondered if he would scream like that when his own symptoms progressed. He wondered if his family had been evacuated yet, if anyone had thought to grab photograph albums, his daughter's favorite toys, the things that made a home more than just an apartment. He asked the doctors. They told him to rest, to conserve his strength. They didn't answer questions. Back in Pripyat, Victor's phone rang at 9 p.m. Moscow, finally, with authorization for evacuation. Not immediate evacuation, that would cause panic. Organized evacuation, beginning Sunday afternoon, temporary relocation for 3 to 5 days until the situation stabilized. 3 to 5 days. The number was political calculation rather than scientific assessment, chosen because it sounded reasonable, because it suggested control, because permanent evacuation would mean admitting the unthinkable. He began making calls, bus depots in Kiev, Ivankiv, Chernobyl. He would need 1,100 buses, maybe 1,200 to be safe. The buses would arrive by noon Sunday. Residents would be informed in the morning. They should bring documents, essential items, enough for a few days. No pets. The official said this specifically. No pets, no livestock, nothing that would slow the boarding process or create disorder. Victor made notes in careful handwriting, trying not to think about the German shepherd his sons loved, the one they'd named Cosmos after the dog sent to space. Dr. Ivanov worked through the night. More patients arrived. Workers from the reactor who'd participated in initial containment efforts, soldiers sent to establish security perimeters without radiation protection, even some Pripyat residents who'd watched the fire from their balconies. Curious about the bright glow, unaware that curiosity could be measured in rems and sieverts. A young mother came in with her 2 children, complaining of metallic taste in their mouths, burning sensations in their throats. He examined them, knowing the taste was radiation, the burning was cellular damage, and there was almost nothing he could do. He administered potassium iodide to protect their thyroids from absorbing radioactive iodine. He gave them fluids for nausea. He admitted them for observation and told the mother it was precautionary. She asked if they were in danger. He said no, everything was under control. The authorities had the situation well in hand. She relaxed visibly, trusting his white coat, his diplomas on the wall, his calm demeanor. He felt something break inside himself, some essential honesty between doctor and patient, but kept his face composed. By midnight, he was drinking in his office, vodka from the bottle kept in his desk drawer for emergencies. This qualified. He'd lost count of the lies he'd told, the reassurances he'd given to people who deserved truth. The Soviet system required this sometimes, the subordination of individual truth to collective narrative. the belief that panic was more dangerous than radiation. He'd been part of the system his whole career, believed in it mostly, but tonight the belief was harder to maintain. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures climbing toward 20 degrees Celsius. Perfect weather for the announcement that began broadcasting at 10 a.m. from loudspeakers mounted throughout the city. The voice was female, carefully modulated to project calm authority. Attention, residents of Pripyat. In connection with the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city. Party and Soviet authorities are taking necessary measures. However, in order to ensure complete safety for the population, especially children, it is necessary to temporarily evacuate the city's residents to nearby settlements. For this purpose, buses will be provided to each residence building today, April 27th, beginning at 2 p.m. Please take your documents, essential personal items, and food for 3 days. Turn off all electrical appliances and water taps, close windows. Please maintain calm and order during the evacuation. The announcement repeated every 20 minutes. People listened, processed, began to move. Some had been waiting for this, bags already packed. Others rushed about in confusion, grabbing items at random, forgetting necessities in their haste. The 3-day timeline shaped decisions. People took changes of clothes but left winter coats, packed food but left family photographs, brought school assignments but left musical instruments. The announcement's careful language suggested temporary inconvenience rather than permanent departure. Victor coordinated from the city center, watching the first buses arrive in long convoys that stretched from the main square to the southern edge of the city. 1,100 buses, just as Moscow had promised, plus additional military transports for overflow. The drivers had been told minimal information. Pick up passengers, deliver them to collective farms and towns outside the exclusion zone, return for more if needed. They stood beside their vehicles smoking cigarettes, watching soldiers with radiation meters check their routes. The evacuation began precisely at 2 p.m., building by building, street by street. Families boarded buses with suitcases and bags, children clutching toys, elderly residents helped up steep steps by neighbors. The process was orderly, almost eerily calm. People talked quietly, speculated about where they were going, when they'd return. Some joked about getting a 3-day vacation courtesy of the state. Others were silent, faces turned toward windows for final looks at apartments they'd decorated, gardens they'd planted, the city they'd built with their labor and hope. Dmitri Sokolov was too sick to evacuate with his family. His wife came to the hospital at noon, their 3-year-old son Alexei in her arms, and Dr. Ivanov had to turn her away. Dmitri was being transferred to Moscow by special transport. She couldn't accompany him. She needed to evacuate with the other residents. She stood in the hallway crying silently while Alexei asked why they couldn't see Papa, why Papa didn't come home. Dr. Ivanov promised Dmitri would join them soon, knowing the promise was false. Dmitri's radiation exposure was lethal. He would die in Moscow within 2 weeks, his body destroyed by invisible particles he'd breathed while fighting a fire no one told him was nuclear. By 6 p.m., Pripyat was nearly empty. 50,000 people removed in 3 hours and 20 minutes, a logistical achievement that would later be studied as a model of crisis evacuation. The buses departed in steady streams, heading west and south, away from the reactor that still burned on the horizon. They passed through checkpoints where soldiers recorded names, checked documents, waved them through toward uncertain destinations. Behind them, the city fell silent. Streetlights turned on automatically as evening approached, illuminating empty playgrounds, abandoned cars, strollers left on sidewalks. Victor was among the last to leave, touring the vacant streets with a small team to verify compliance. They found a few holdouts, elderly residents who refused to abandon homes they'd lived in for decades, people who insisted the danger was exaggerated, that Soviet construction was stronger than any accident. Victor didn't force them. He noted their locations, moved on. His own apartment had been locked that morning, belongings left exactly as they were. Breakfast dishes in the sink, his son's beds unmade, family photographs on the mantel. He'd taken only his party identification and a single photograph of his wife. Everything else could wait 3 days. The exclusion zone expanded in concentric circles over the following weeks, drawn by technicians with maps and radiation meters, boundaries marked by checkpoints that became permanent installations. 30 kilometers initially, the distance considered safe for temporary retreat. Then, adjustments as wind patterns carried contamination north toward Belarus, west toward Poland, south across Ukraine's agricultural heartland. The maps were redrawn repeatedly, each revision erasing more villages, more farmland, more futures from the landscape of possibility. Dmitri Sokolov died on May 11th, 14 days after the accident, in Moscow Hospital No. 6. His body had fought against damage that medical science couldn't reverse. Bone marrow destroyed, immune system collapsed, organs failing sequentially despite every intervention the Soviet Union's best doctors could provide. His wife received notification by telegram 3 days later, the delay unexplained but not unusual in a system where information moved through official channels at bureaucratic pace. She was living in a collective farm dormitory outside Ivankiv with her son, sharing 2 rooms with 3 other displaced families. The telegram was delivered to the farm's administrative office, handed to her by a clerk who looked away while she read it. She requested permission to attend the funeral. Permission was denied. Dmitri's body, along with those of other firefighters and reactor workers who'd absorbed lethal doses, was buried in lead-lined coffins at Matino Cemetery in Moscow, graves sealed with concrete to contain radiation that would persist for centuries. His family received no personal effects, no opportunity for traditional farewell, no closure beyond the telegram's stark language. Dmitri Sergeyevich Sokolov died in service to the Soviet people. May his sacrifice be remembered. Aleksandr Petrov survived 3 weeks before succumbing on May 18th. His wife and daughter had been evacuated to her sister's apartment in Zhytomyr, 90 kilometers from Pripyat, close enough that she could see the glow on the northern horizon some nights when the cloud cover was low. She'd written him letters that hospital staff promised to deliver, filling pages with ordinary details, their daughter's progress in her new school, relatives who'd offered help, plans for when they could return home. The letters were found in a drawer after his death, unopened. His condition had deteriorated too rapidly for reading, for coherent conversation, for anything except morphine and the slow extinction of radiation-damaged cells. Viktor Volkov maintained his position in the Regional Civil Defense Administration, reassigned to managing the long-term evacuation infrastructure. The 3-day relocation became permanent in early May, when measurements showed radiation levels that wouldn't decline to safe levels for decades. He oversaw the distribution of compensation payments, the assignment of replacement housing, the bureaucratic machinery that processed 50,000 displaced lives through forms and procedures. He worked 18-hour days, slept in his office, and developed an ulcer that would trouble him for the rest of his life. His family remained in his mother-in-law's village, where his sons attended local school and learned to speak with rural accents. He visited once monthly, the visit strained by distance and exhaustion, and the unspoken question his wife never asked directly. "Why did you send us away hours before you sent everyone else?" He had no answer she would accept. No justification that didn't sound like the preservation of privilege in a system supposedly built on equality. They stopped discussing it. They stopped discussing many things. The marriage survived, but transformed into something functional rather than intimate. Dr. Sergei Ivanov requested early retirement in June, citing health concerns that were partly genuine and partly excuse. The hospital administration accepted without protest, perhaps grateful to be rid of someone who'd witnessed too much, who carried the weight of unavoidable complicity. He moved to Odessa, as far from Chernobyl as one could get while remaining in Ukraine, and took a position at a clinic where no one asked about his previous posting. He told new colleagues he'd worked in general practice in a small town, nothing remarkable. They had no reason to doubt him. But he dreamed about Pripyat Hospital most nights, the corridors filling with patients showing symptoms he couldn't name, the radiation counters clicking their warnings no one heeded, the young mother asking if her children were in danger, while metallic taste filled their mouths. He dreamed about Dmitri's wife believing his reassurances, about all the reassurances he'd given on instructions from administrators who prioritized politics over health. He began drinking more seriously, vodka before dinner becoming vodka instead of dinner, until his new colleagues started noticing, started asking questions. He deflected with practiced ease. The reactor itself burned for 10 days before being entombed beneath 5,000 tons of sand, lead and boron dropped by helicopter pilots who flew through radiation plumes that shortened their lives by years. The effort required 600 helicopter flights, pilots taking turns because exposure limits meant each could fly only once or twice before exceeding safe doses. They flew anyway, understanding that stopping the reaction was worth the personal cost, that failure meant catastrophe on a scale that would make the initial explosion seem minor by comparison. By November, a concrete sarcophagus enclosed Reactor 4, a massive structure built by workers operating in short shifts to minimize exposure, constructed with such haste that cracks appeared in the concrete before construction finished. The sarcophagus was designed as a temporary solution, expected to last 30 years at most. It became the tomb of a machine that had promised unlimited clean energy and delivered instead a demonstration of how catastrophically technology could fail when safety was subordinated to schedule, when design flaws were classified rather than corrected, when operators were trained to follow procedures without fully understanding the systems they controlled. Pripyat remained empty, evolving from evacuated city to abandoned ruin with remarkable speed. Windows broken by scavengers looking for anything valuable that had been left behind, copper wire, aluminum fixtures, anything that could be sold. Vegetation beginning its patient reclamation, grass growing through cracks in pavement, vines climbing apartment buildings, trees sprouting in school gymnasiums. The swimming pool that had been scheduled to open in summer 1986 filled with rainwater and debris, becoming a monument to interrupted futures. The Ferris wheel in the Central Amusement Park stood motionless, painted carriages fading in weather they'd never been designed to endure. The park had been scheduled to open May 1st for the May Day celebrations, 5 days after the accident. Workers had completed installation just days before the evacuation, testing the rides, checking safety mechanisms, preparing for crowds that would never arrive. Now it stood as perhaps the most photographed symbol of Chernobyl, the bright yellow carriages against gray sky, suggesting childhood and loss in equal measure. In the months and years that followed, the full scope of contamination became clearer through measurements and models. Radioactive particles had spread across most of Europe, detected in Norway, Sweden, Finland, as far west as Wales and Scotland. Most heavily contaminated were areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, within 100 kilometers of the reactor. Land that had fed millions became unusable. Crops that had promised harvest had to be destroyed. Livestock that absorbed cesium through grass had to be culled. The economic damage ran to hundreds of billions of rubles, but the human cost was harder to calculate. Estimates of deaths attributable to Chernobyl vary wildly depending on methodology and political perspective. The immediate deaths, firefighters, reactor workers, helicopter pilots who absorbed fatal doses within hours or days, numbered in the dozens. The longer-term deaths from cancers induced by radiation exposure, from compromised immune systems, from environmental contamination working its slow effect on populations across affected regions. Those numbers range from thousands to hundreds of thousands depending on which models one trusts, which studies one credits, which definitions of causation one accepts. The children of Pripyat grew up displaced, scattered across the Soviet Union and later independent Ukraine, carrying memories of a home they couldn't return to and often struggled to explain. Some forgot the city entirely, their childhood memories overwritten by later experiences. Others held on to fragments, the taste of ice cream from the cafe on Lenin Street, the view from their apartment balcony, the sound of the city's public address system making morning announcements. They learned not to mention Chernobyl in casual conversation, discovered that identifying themselves as survivors brought either excessive sympathy or uncomfortable silence. Aleksandr's daughter kept one of her father's drawings pinned above her desk through university, through marriage, through the birth of her own children. a technical schematic he'd brought home once, explaining how the reactor worked, how the control systems maintained balance, how safety was ensured through redundant mechanisms. She never fully understood the drawing, never studied nuclear physics, but kept it anyway, as connection to a father she barely remembered, except through photographs and stories her mother told with increasing infrequency as years passed and memory itself became contaminated with uncertainty about what had actually happened versus what had been said to have happened. Dmitri's son grew up without clear memories of his father, only impressions preserved in photographs and his mother's carefully edited stories. She told him his father was a hero, which was true. She told him his father had saved the city, which was partly true. The firefighters had prevented the initial blaze from spreading to the other reactors, had contained what could have been an even worse catastrophe. She didn't tell him about the hospital visits she'd been denied, about the telegram that had arrived days late, about the grave she'd never been allowed to visit. Some truth served no purpose except to hurt. Victor's career continued until Soviet collapse in 1991, when the administrative structures he'd served dissolved into the independent states that emerged from the USSR's remnants. He found work in Ukraine's new civil emergency management system, his experience with Chernobyl making him valuable to a government learning to manage the ongoing costs of the disaster without Moscow's direction or resources. He never visited Pripyat after the evacuation, though his work sometimes brought him near the exclusion zone. He told himself it was unnecessary, that the past was past, that looking backward served no practical purpose. Dr. Ivanov died in 1994, liver failure from drinking, officially unrelated to Chernobyl, though those who knew him suspected otherwise. His colleagues at the Odessa clinic remembered him as competent but distant, functional but haunted, the kind of doctor who did his work adequately without ever seeming fully present. His apartment yielded few personal effects: medical textbooks, basic furniture, empty bottles carefully hidden in cupboards. No photographs of Pripyat, no mementos of his career there, nothing to suggest he'd once been part of a city that no longer existed. He'd erased that period as thoroughly as radiation had erased the city itself. The reactor burns no longer, but the contamination persists. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, meaning the radiation from 1986 will take until 2016 to decline by half, until 2046 to quarter, until sometime in the 22nd century to approach levels where permanent human habitation might be reconsidered. Plutonium-239, also released in significant quantities, has a half-life of 24,000 years. The land itself has become a clock measuring time in radioactive decay, in the slow transformation of dangerous isotopes into slightly less dangerous forms, in the patient work of physics that proceeds regardless of human need or desire. Pripyat stands empty still, gradually collapsing under the weight of weather and time, becoming less a city than a monument to a particular moment in history, when technology and hubris and circumstance combine to demonstrate that some mistakes persist beyond the lives of those who made them. Tour groups visit now, foreigners paying for guided trips through the exclusion zone, photographing abandoned buildings and rusting vehicles in the famous Ferris wheel that never turned. They walk where 50,000 people once lived, where children played and couples fell in love, and ordinary life unfolded until the night the reactor burned and everything changed in ways that couldn't be changed back. The story doesn't end because the contamination doesn't end, because the children exposed to radiation in 1986 carry effects that will pass to their children and grandchildren in ways still being studied, because the land remembers what happened even after human memory fails. History moves forward, but some events cast shadows that extend across generations, that mark landscapes and bodies and collective consciousness with persistence that defies forgetting. Chernobyl was such an event, a night when the sky burned blue and beautiful and deadly, when invisible force became visible catastrophe, when the future promised by atomic power revealed its darkest possibility.